a little bit on how to create more user-friendly PowerPoints if that's what you're interested in doing in your classroom. This morning I presented, this is one of those days, Diane, where I'm going from thing to thing to thing. So this morning I presented to the history education program has a collaborative symposium every year with the district and with McLean County Museum of History. And I presented on centering the histories of women and girls. And I was focusing on K through 8 education, but we also went into K through 12. And it was interesting to me. I received a number of messages through the chat, some private messages. A couple of people offered it openly in a point that I had made. And the point was to try to bring joy into your classroom and try to find a subject that students feel good about coming into your classroom, whether that's through the computer or walking in, hopefully next fall. Many of us will be able to do that again, walking into or moving into a physical space. And I don't mean, you know, the kendo kind of joy where you're picking up objects and cleaning out your cupboards. I'm referring here to providing information for your students that help them move through their lives, that help them move through their days in a comfortable fashion. And that we don't always need to be antagonistic or aggressive or assertive in terms of debating in our classrooms or problematizing an issue. That sometimes, and especially currently, students just want to laugh. Students want to be able to talk with each other. And so one of the things that I've been doing is, and I've done this for years and I've been continuing to do this on Zoom, is I pop into, if the class starts on the hour, say at 2 o'clock, I try to get on at 10 of, and I have music playing. And I let them know what if the music connects to the lesson, but sometimes it's just music that I feel good about that day. And then the students start in the chat and you know, what are you playing? Have you ever been to that concert? Where might I get this music? What kind of streaming do you do? Blah, blah, blah. It has nothing to do with what we're dealing with that particular day. It just gets us talking. It gets us interacting. And I have found that music is a non-threatening way in which to present that sort of an experience. So just a little something to think about. You'll notice on the left that I have my name, my affiliations. I'm associate professor in history. I'm a core faculty member with women's gender and sexuality studies. And I do, in a next slide, I'll give you some more in terms of classroom protocols. But I think one thing that helps students feel comfortable is when you provide for them a way that you feel comfortable for them to refer to you. So I know that some faculty and some disciplines have a first name basis interaction, others do not. And students get very confused. Do I call her Dr. Ciani? Do I call her Kyle? What do I call her? Do I call her professor? What's the culture? And I think it's very important to communicate to students in a non-threatening way, not to demand of them, but to let them know, you know, I in my emails, I just signed my emails, Dr. Ciani, and they get they understand it. When I'm doing my introductions, I will let them know, I will refer to myself as Dr. Ciani or whatever. That's the culture in our department. If I were in another program, another department, I might refer to myself as Kyle. So I try to make sure that I understand the culture and that I communicate that to the students. So just a couple of things to think about. Something that I would like you all to know as my colleagues is that I am not an expert in inclusive content and interactions. I don't write, I don't publish in this area. Diane asked me to do this, and thank you, Diane, for recognizing that I try to work hard at this. But I'm not a scholar of inclusive content and interactions. And I encourage all of you, if you haven't done so already, to view what Julie and Becky have already offered to us. The videos are up on the CAS website. And Julie has offered a lot of literature, a lot of scholarly citations and information that I think is really helpful. And Becky's connection to the sciences, I found fascinating because it really overlapped with history, and I loved her session. Oh, there goes the phone, ignore it. So know that I would like to create a resource list for you all after our session today. I made the decision to not pull together resources because I wasn't sure what people wanted today. So after I hear our conversation, then I'm going to go back, pull together some resources that I've used, and I'm assuming I can send those to who would I do? Maybe Denise, and they will get loaded up with the video.
Yes, Kyle. Yeah, Denise.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I'll take, if you can send them to me.
Okay. So that's what we'll do. So today's plan is that we're going to talk a couple of resources that I have up on the slide, and then some protocols. I'm going to give you an example of a way that I handle diverse content to try to make my history classes more inclusive, and then have some discussion. So I've put up here 3 resources. There are many in our community, whether we're talking about the Illinois State community or the McLean County community. The diversity inclusion website, I find very helpful. There are links specifically for faculty. There are links for faculty and staff. There are links for students. And I think that if you haven't been to that site in this semester, I encourage you to do so, because they're constantly updating it. And I was very much impressed by the ways in which they are connecting with what some of us have been asking to be transmitted to our community. So I want to, honor Professor Doris Houston in social work, who's now in the president's office, for leading that effort. Below that is the webpage for student access and accommodations. We all should be familiar with the language that we include in our syllabi. And something that I am seeing more regularly from students, and is that they are choosing not to share their accommodation with faculty. So and I learned that a couple of years ago in talking with some students, because they don't want faculty to make a judgment about them. And so what I always do before any sort of assessment, before any sort of presentation that a student might do, anything that has an evaluative component, assessment component to it, I always encourage them broadly. I always make an announcement in the class. I send an announcement in writing as well as say it in my synchronous Zoom to make sure that you are communicating any access and accommodation services that you need your faculty to know, just to kind of give them an extra little push. I want them to understand that it's not, any sort of judgment in terms of certainly what I'm doing, and it helps me to provide those resources for them. And then the Bloomington Normal Area LGBTQIA plus. This is a new PDF file. I know that Dave Bentlin in the president's office was working on this in the fall. The business and resource directory for 2021. It's hot off the presses. It's a PDF. I would encourage you all to access it and use the businesses that are listed there to support those businesses and resources. Something that I do, and I don't know, I just don't think of these things as big deals, but apparently not everybody does it. I have a big bulletin board outside my office space in Schrader Hall. It is dedicated to the Women and Gender Studies and Sexualities program. And I put a lot of information on there about the WGSS program, but I also put information like this directory. I would print that out and or put the title page up there so that students know about resources in the community. I have information about health resources, resources about domestic violence, rape and sexual assault. So all kinds of information for students. It is taken because the copies are gone. I replenish it regularly. And so I know that this is a bulletin board that people use. So that's one way that students, I hope, feel as though they're comfortable in bringing up certain historical topics that have to do with domestic violence or rape and sexual assault, LGBTQI issues, etc. So just some ideas there. So in terms of classroom protocols, and again, I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence. I have found that people do a lot of these things. I'm just putting them all in one place. So in terms of classroom protocols, I think it's very critical that we offer students the opportunity to offer their pronouns and pronunciation of their names, as well as to know ours. And I was really pleased to see the recent announcement that faculty, staff, and students can now go into their My Spaces and update their pronouns. You'll see on my Zoom name, I do have my pronouns she, her, hers. Actually, I just have she and her because it wasn't fitting well enough on there. So that way people know automatically through Zoom what my pronouns are. One thing that is often difficult for people is the pronunciation of my name. And over the years, I sort of have a connection, I think, with some students who have names and pronouns that perhaps don't always assign or align to how people perceive them. I have a first name that people often think is a masculine first name. And I have a last name that people who speak the Romance languages want to pronounce in ways that our family does not pronounce. So I always provide a pronunciation of my name, Ciani, and ask students for their pronunciation. I think it's really important for students who have names first and last that you feel uncomfortable with to ask for a phonetic so that you are honoring their culture and the ways in which they pronounce their name, the way that they pronounce their name. It's really, it just makes them feel more comfortable. I think also that, and this is something that those of you who are in our session right now who are early career people, you have to really think about this third issue of diverse modes of learning, and perhaps talk with your chair and talk with your DFSC, SFSCs about, because it takes a lot of time. I use a lot of different ways of communicating lessons within each of my course. And I don't completely reimagine my course at this point in my life. My career, I know sort of what works and what doesn't. So I have kind of a tried and true method. But certainly with our transfer to virtual learning in March, I did reimagine all of my classes, and all of my classes have been new preparations. It took a lot of time. The early career people don't have the luxury of reimagining or reconfiguring and using new modes of learning every time you teach a class. So of course you need to use those tried and true. But an easy way to update your learning is just to do some digital exploring. Use some digital websites within your discipline. I'm imagining every day I get something from the history profession that is offering me a new type of tool or lesson plan, and I'm imagining that other people are receiving those things as well. But I did want to provide a word of caution that when you're using those diverse modes of learning, two things: they take time to prep, and secondly, they may not work. And you have to be willing to recognize and acknowledge to the students, this did not work the way I thought it was going to. Students love it when I say, oh, oops, it didn't work. Let's redo this. Because then they know that, that we're human, and that, oh gosh, she is actually working on it. She is actually taking our feedback and moving forward. But I also recognize that I have the luxury of being a tenured associate professor. And so again, I want to offer the caution that I understand that early career people may not be able to do that. Something that I've been seeing on an increasing basis is the terrible use of PowerPoints. And there's a resource that I am going to include in my list that I want people to be aware of. And I saw that Joe Blaney was on the call, and he and I were on a committee together, the Digital Accessibility Committee, which was a university-wide committee. And on that committee, we had an opportunity to explore a book by Sarah Horton. It's called A Web for Everyone, Designing Accessible User Experiences. A Web for Everyone, Designing Accessible User Experiences. And it was published in 2014. It's expensive, you know, a paperback is like 60 bucks. The library has a couple of copies of it though. And I encourage folks to check it out, and, you know, you're not going to read it word for word, but browse it I recommend browsing to get information about what works for low vision and what doesn't, what works for hearing impaired and what doesn't. Some of those things that if you are not low vision, you take for granted. If you are not hearing impaired, you take for granted. So, excuse me, one of the things that I know I've noticed a lot, pardon me, that I've noticed a lot in just different presentations that I've gone to over the last couple of years is that people are using fonts and types of slides that are not accessible to the larger group of people who they might be interacting with. And the designs that you get through the PowerPoint model, they're designed for humanities or for sciences or for the arts, but you need to tweak those. And, you know, we don't want to be having walls of text. We don't want to have too small of fonts. Some people prefer serif, some people prefer sans serif, some groups. So I think it's important for us to educate ourselves as to what works in communities. So we can talk more about that. But just to throw that out there. So in terms of providing some diverse content, and this, I want to emphasize to people that I'm speaking from the discipline of history. My PhD is in the history of women and gender. So I'm coming at my diverse content from that expertise. And, you know, Doug and I came to ISU in the fall of 2001. So we're entering our 20th year. And doggone it if people are still teaching the same darn thing throughout the country in terms of some subjects. In 2020 was the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment. This is kind of a joke, but with Doug and I, but there are lots of people who don't really understand what I do, who think that women's history is a women's history course is 16 weeks of looking at suffrage. Women have done lots of other things than secured the right to vote. So I'm not a suffrage expert. I have been a consultant for museums and archives that do specialize in suffrage content, but I was consulting as a historian of women's history in general, and to make sure that their collections were accessible to all women, all subjects, and not as a suffrage expert. So we do have sub specialties within our field of women's history. I love this image because it just emphasizes to me how non-inclusive if people can be, if when you're designing a class and you're doing it on the 20th century and you throw in in the Women Week, or you throw in during February the Black History Week, or you throw in in March, the LGBTQ week, that's not inclusive. That's I'm not quite sure what that is. So I would encourage us all to update our scholarship. Those of us who received our PhDs in the late 90s, the early 2000s, our experiences are very different in terms of our graduate work than those people who secured their PhDs 5 years ago. So reach out to your early career colleagues and find out the kinds of scholarship that they're interested in and that they're using. But more importantly, help them, because the other thing that might have happened is that they may have been trained in a very quote unquote traditional way. I loved Becky Darner's illustration of the ways in which you can um, uh, diversify the history of the eugenics movement, and you know, her illustration of diversity within the sciences I found very interesting. Use new examples in terms of your materials. I'm going to give you an example of that in a moment. A point that Julie Jung made in her presentation was that updating your scholarship and updating your syllabus is not only, it doesn't apply to adding a scholar from a Black, Indigenous, person of color community. That's a good thing. That's absolutely a good thing, but that's not going far enough. You need to provide content that allows for the entire student community in your course to understand that these people are not unusual in terms of their scholarship. We need to normalize inclusivity. And sometimes if we approach our content, our syllabi with an add-on approach, then you get a subject where, oh, this was an added on. Yeah, the white people are still at the center of the lesson. And then let's look at someone who was a Black activist. Oh, and then maybe a Chicana. Okay. Rather than having at the center of your content these new examples. Don't add it on. And unfortunately, that leads to having to reconfigure the entire your entire content. But that's a good thing. In terms of the updating your scholarship, for me, I've had a fabulous opportunity of doing that in terms of the 19th Amendment because of the centennial. Our discipline has had about 22 new books come out, and they revolve around the centrality of Black, Indigenous, people of color being part of or driving the conversation, the movements of the 19th Amendment. So I've been allowed to teach students the power of primary sources, the power of using this new scholarship, and why it's important. So I want to give you just an example here of a slide that that is part of a content that I use on what's called the New Woman. So the New Woman was a middle-class educated woman that emerges in the late 19th century. And the New Woman is often understood in history, in popular culture, as a white middle class woman. And what I want students to understand is that this educated woman came from a lot of diverse communities. And so what I have done is selected 3 women who are very important in terms of activism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I've simply ordered them in terms of birth date. And so we have, but they're 3 diverse women. Anna Julia Cooper, and excuse me, there's a typo, it's Julia, not Julie. Anna Julia Cooper was born into slavery in 1858. Her mother was enslaved, her father was her mother's master. Cooper is going to go on to become an important advocate for educating young girls, young Black girls. She will eventually secure her PhD. She experiences the racism that was rampant in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But she is dedicated to providing not just the talented 10th, who W.E.B. Du Bois talks about in terms of young Black men, but she challenged that notion of only focusing on young Black men and said, we need to focus on our girls as well. Let's not leave them behind. Jane Addams in the middle, born 2 years later. She is someone who is oftentimes seen as the quintessential woman who is this new woman who is a progressive era leader, Nobel Peace Prize recipient. She is the creator of Hull House in Chicago. She drives the settlement house movement in the United States. She creates an incredible network of women professionals. She is known, she creates the phrase public mother. She wouldn't have called herself lesbian at the time because that word wouldn't have been part of her lexicon. But Jane Addams was always in committed monogamous relationships with other women. That's not talked about a lot in terms of Jane Addams. We can normalize those relationships. She created Hull House with Ellen Gates Starr, who the 2 of them met when they both attended Rockford Seminary up in North Rockford, Illinois. They traveled to England together. They discovered the settlement house movement in England together and brought it back to the States together. The 3rd individual, Susan LaFlèche-Picotte, who's a physician, is a member of the Omaha Nation. Picotte is someone who becomes the first Indigenous woman in the United States to receive a medical degree. She is a contemporary of Addams. She is a contemporary of Cooper. She is seldom talked about. She is someone who she attended the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia through the good graces and philanthropy, of a women's group who supported Indigenous children in terms of their educations. Dr. LaFlèche-Picotte is someone who is from a very important family among the Omaha people. Her father was a chief. She was affluent. She was powerful. She had a strong lineage within her nation. She stayed in Philadelphia for a year after securing her medical degree, but then she chooses to return to the reservation, and she has a practice there in providing health care to that the people who are living on that reservation. Cooper and Picotte have far more formal education than Jane Addams. But it's Jane Addams that shows up in the textbooks at the primary, at the middle school, at the high school levels. So it's my charge at the college level to repair that a little bit and to introduce students to very different and a more inclusive experience in terms of the realities of history. And then the third thing, and a place where I will end. I'll put up a question after this, but I take time recognizing my failings. Something that I have been studying this last year is disability history. Disability history is a relatively new stream of discipline within the larger field. And I've got a website, this website, screenshot from the Disability History Museum. And I realized that this was a failing of mine when I had a student 2 years ago ask me if I could integrate into a recent women's history class more information about how educators, especially women educators, were dealing with both mental health and with autism. Especially this student was a special education student and wanted to have a little bit more history in that regard. You know, I always include Dorothy Dix in my lessons. She's known as the mother of mental health reform, especially in regards to women and asylums in the 19th century. I always talk about Dr. Edward Clark, who thought that all women were hysterical and didn't want young women to go to higher schools of higher education because it would strip them of their powers to reproduce children. But I hadn't done a whole lot with the histories of the spectrum. And I continue to learn about that. And I also do a lot in terms of the eugenics movement. But I think it's important for us to recognize what perhaps our failings are. Maybe I shouldn't use the word failings, but what we should perhaps, how we can improve ourselves a little bit. And then thinking about what strategies we have in order to make our own classrooms comfortable learning environments. I can repeat that, but you know, I'm going to stop sharing at this point. But I would be interested to know what the experiences that other people have and what they use in their classrooms, how they make their classrooms comfortable for their students is really what I'm most interested in learning from you all. So I'll sort of open it up. And
Kyle, I just want to make a comment. You had started out saying that you're not a scholar on inclusivity and that sort of a thing, but that's why your presentation is so valuable, is that you're an excellent teacher that very intentionally makes this a priority in your classroom, and that we all have the capacity for that.
Thanks, Diane. I'm, I do want to emphasize that it's a lot of work, right? So for those of us to do this, for those of us to feel comfortable in doing this, we have to not see it as something that the institution is forcing on us. but I would hope that we see this as helping our students to feel comfortable. Gosh, we want them to come to our classrooms, right? We want them to participate, and we want them to learn. And I want to learn from them. And so I think that if we have a comfortable environment where they don't feel like, oh gosh, she's going to call them, it just helps the whole experience.
So teaching is
Yeah,
relational.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Comments, Kyle has invited us to share what might work for us. Kyle, I wanted, while people are thinking of their example, and I don't see anybody with their hand up, I want to share one experience that I'm aware of from my own discipline, and that's in social work. And we were having this type of a conversation. I know Chris Jesfield's here, he probably knows what I'm going to talk about, and maybe others of you have heard this. But we were called to examine some curricular content in a course, which is really about human development, and it relies heavily on the seminal experts in that, which are primarily dead white men. And we had this tension of, well, what do we do with this curriculum? Because we have to really teach the godparents of human development. But we came to realize we can teach that, but there is plenty of literature there that also gives the critical lens to that. So how does this theory look in terms of critical race theory? How does this theory work in terms of queer theory? And so I would just challenge us all, if we think we're from a discipline in Kyle history, you point out with how Jane Addams was centered, we sometimes have to go beyond what people just accept as the seminal theorist and bring in voices about that.
Yeah, I would, I tried to do that with that example of Cooper and Adams and Picotte. There are many ways in which, that's a quick way of doing that. But I think that if you can, maybe use a comparative model. Becky did that in her presentation as well, right? Using a comparison, so that yes, let's, of course we have to use the grandparents as you noted, Diane, but that doesn't mean that we need to exclude everybody else. And sometimes people like Cooper and Picotte are more important in terms of the overall effect and influences that they created in a time period than someone who is part of the quote unquote canon. Roth, you've had your hand up very patiently.
So you had mentioned reminding students about the SAAS letters, which I think is a really good idea, because I kept finding some students would wait until after the first big assignment is due and then come back with the accommodation. So I think that's a good idea, but this pertains more toward when you're in-person teaching. I always try to make it a point to make sure they know that they can get me that letter confidentially, because I don't want people going, yes, I have a letter, and come up to the front of the room in front of all their peers, which in my PhD program, for some reason, the first day students would all line up, and that's what they were doing. They said, here's my letter. So I had to make it a point to say, email me that, or come to the one-on-one scheduled meeting so we can discuss that. So I think it keeps a little more confidentiality around it, and it normalizes them providing that letter.
Absolutely. And I know that accommodations is encouraging students to email that to their faculty so that that confidentiality does remain. You never want to accept something in a classroom, and for goodness sake, don't ask people to, Everyone with an SAA, raise your hand, right? I mean, it is absolutely confidential. Thanks for that, Roth. Pete?
Hi, Kyle. Thank you so much for leading this. This is very cool. Very fun.
Yeah, sure.
I wanted to share an idea that I've been doing pretty much whenever it seems that it fits a class that I lead. I like to share with my students the stuff I'm wrestling with. Just as an example, I teach a class this semester on leadership, and we were going over models of and typologies of how followers can effectively communicate not only with each other, but with leaders. One of them is called a 4D or 4-dimensional model. And I thought it very odd that there was no visualization of it. And so I posed 3 different models to my students. Which one do you think works? Does it help you understand these concepts as it's divided? Because it was talking about quadrants, but they didn't show it in a visual way. And so it was kind of fun to be able to give students a kind of window into the world of, I suppose, scholarship and trying to wrestle with stuff and asking them for their opinion. And it was kind of a neat little discussion. And I do mean little discussion, but it was kind of, and I've done that multiple times over the years with actually really positive results. And that's kind of fun to do.
Yeah, you know, Pete, you reminded me of something that I didn't include in the formal presentation, and that is to allow, I think part of inclusive teaching and learning is to have students engage in research and presentation. So we have the University Research Symposium, we have the Women's Gender Sexuality Studies Symposium every, those are annuals. I know in COM, you all have your COM week where students are always engaged, and the other disciplines have ways in which they can connect students to research. And that makes students feel as though they are, first of all, they can put it on their CV, right? So it's a CV builder for them, but it also it gives them a window into what you're doing, Pete. It helps them be a quote unquote authority. It connects you with scholarship in ways that, and so I always mentor students. Every year I have students who are presenting at those, again, it's work. I mean, it's part of your, we don't, Diane, don't listen to this, but we don't get credit for teaching like we do for publishing, right? Not a mystery. So you have to, especially early career folks, you have to really think hard about that. Joe, what's going on? You got your hand up.
Yeah, Kyle, thanks. This is great. Can I go back to something you said very close to the beginning, having to do with the, some of us have this proclivity to require the camera to be on. And I'm one of those people. I'll admit that I like the eye contact, and I kind of need the ability to pick up on nonverbals.
Oh, Steve just put his camera back on.
You better. And I'm just wondering, how can we, I understand the concerns you're talking about, and I totally sensitive to that. I've got students taking class, so they're like fitting it in on their break at work, right?
Yeah.
And, in their work clothes and so forth. So I know that there's all those struggles, socioeconomic, are occurring. How can we guarantee the interactivity and sort of accountability in the interactions that those of us who teach with a dialectic model, how can we guarantee that?
Yeah. Well, that's a great discussion. I'll just offer one quick thing. I do breakout rooms, and students, what I have found is that within the breakout room, students have their cameras on with each other. And so they are, I will offer a question. If there are maybe, in a large class, they're separated into 4 breakout rooms. I want them to come up with a solution to a problem that I offer. and then they come back and present it to the class. They, one person is supposed to present it to the class. You have the ability to pop into each room and see what's going on. And when I do that, and I tell them that I'm doing that, I'll say, I'm going to pop into each room and see if you have any questions for me. They all have their cameras on. They don't care if each other's, if they don't want me to see them sitting where they're sitting. And I really understand that. So that might be something, Joe, that you can adopt. I don't know if you do breakout rooms. What are others doing in that regard?
I guess I would come in and co-sign real quick and say that I've noticed that too, where when there's breakout rooms involved, students are more likely to take it off and participate that way. I would also say that sometimes like giving them time on their own, so like assigning a task that they can participate in on their own and say, go do that for 15 minutes. And then when they come back to the large group, usually the participation's a little bit better if they've had time to sort of think about what it is that they want to share.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Those are great ideas, Brea. In the chat, Joe, are you seeing the chat here? Roth is saying, I've been exploring Nearpod for use in synchronous.
Yeah.
Keith, you've got your hand up. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, last semester, I had a student who participated via cell phone while parking cars at his job in a Zoom session. And so, I think to some degree, they're afraid of looking like they're doing something they shouldn't be if they have the camera on. But if you can convey to them that you're not going to be upset with them if they have you in the cup holder while parking cars, like my student, at least then they might put it on.
I totally agree. I think it's all about helping them feel comfortable. And I think something else that has, they think faculty live in these big mansions, right? Well, I don't know about you, but Doug and I do not live, we have an 850 square foot home, and I'm in my little corner in a room. I won't tell you which room it is, but I think if you can make students feel comfortable with that you're also having to navigate some things, right? Joe, I don't know if that helps. Does anybody else have something to offer?
It does.
along
It's
those
all
lines?
Thank you.
How about other questions
Keith,
or
did you have another,
comments?
Keith, did you have another question that was up from before?
No, that was another question.
Okay.
So maybe a question and a quick comment. One thing I've been experimenting with that I've liked and that students have seemed to like over the past few years is giving them opportunities to vote or otherwise come to consensus on elements of the syllabus, on submission dates, on various aspects of the course. And so just trying to give them a little bit more democratic control over what the classroom looks like. And you can start simple with just when is something going to be due. I found they've been much more willing that they've felt more involved after that. In terms of a question, and this goes to Diane's comment earlier on. So Kyle, your women's history course is obviously so great about doing more inclusive content, but then we have big things like the survey, the sort of standard courses that have been around a long time, and I think in a lot of departments. How have you tried to navigate some of those old structures and the desire to bring in newer fields or fields that sometimes fall out of those, and how have you made that work?
So that slide was not from a women's history class. So that slide is from a general survey class. So I you know, and I'm thinking about my survey 135. So the first half of US history. So it goes from 1500 to 1865, so up to the Civil War. And one of the things, so I always use a theme, and this last 2 years, I've been really focusing on racial justice. And I want students to understand the legal parameters of chattel slavery and how different empires adopted the system of slavery and why they adopted the system of slavery. And so I have a very different take on history than is in the textbooks, perhaps, because I'm using that social justice perspective. I start, you know, we do a lot with how indigenous populations were colonized and the influences of that, and then I move in, you know, so with using social justice, racialized formation, I should say formations of race in the Americas, I'm able to be pretty inclusive. I don't know if that answers anything.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kyle.
Okay, yeah.
Kyle, of all the things you talked about today, great value, but for me, what was the most valuable for me was the emphasis of inclusive content is not just add on, that it really is bringing into the center from a critical perspective other voices that normally are not heard. It's not just, oh, and then this week we're going to have the Black History Month, you know. Right.
You know, I think, yeah, and I always, well, because my expertise is in women, in the histories of women and gender, so for the colonial history class, when I introduce indentured servitude, I use an example of a little girl who was indentured. I don't use an example of the quintessential indentured servant who was a 25-year-old man. So, and I don't make a big deal about it, you know, but just by using different, you know, I don't pinpoint that, oh, now I'm going to use no, it's just, that's the example that I use. So it becomes a more, I think, a much more inclusive experience.
Kyle, I want to just be respectful of time, because
yeah.
we normally allow an hour, but I'd like to say, could you all join me in thanking Kyle for giving her time and her expertise in this way? Clap however you want to. And I don't want to encroach on your time either, Kyle, but I guess if people want to hang and have comments, is that okay? I'll keep the room open.
Yeah, I was just going to start making some risotto, but
are we invited? Okay, so that's perfect.
No, I'm joking. This was the last thing that I had